Bună seara. I'd like to welcome everyone to the webinar this evening, sponsored by Romania Without Orphans. And the subject is going to be attachment. And one little note before we get started, if you would please make sure that you keep your videos and mics turned off. Helps to reduce interference and keep the sound at the screen where it needs to be for the presenter. One other thing, if I could, when you have throughout the webinar, if you would write them in the chat to ARFO, specifically to ARFO, so that Alina is going to be gathering the questions for us and putting them in a document, and we're going to be reading them and working through them toward the end of the webinar. My name is Nathan Burke, and I am one of the members of Romania Without Orphans, and I'm going to be introducing Dr. Andi Thacker. As a professor of biblical counseling in the Biblical Counseling Department for Dallas Theological Seminary, Dr. Thacker is passionate about teaching counseling students to integrate scripture and psychology and apply these concepts to real-life counseling situations. In addition to her teaching responsibilities at DTS, Dr. Thacker maintains a small private practice in which she specializes with children and adolescents and supervises LPC interns. Dr. Thacker completed her training with a master's degree in biblical counseling from Dallas Theological Seminary and has a Ph.D. in counselor education and supervision from the University of North Texas. Dr. Thacker is a licensed a licensed professional counselor, a board-approved supervisor, a registered play therapist supervisor, and a nationally certified counselor. Most importantly, she is married to Chad, and they have 3 children, Emerson, Will, and Webb. So, Andi, we want to welcome you to the webinar tonight. We're grateful for the expertise that you're bringing, and I know from speaking with you that you also bring a personal connection to adoption.
Yeah, I do. Thanks, Nathan, for introducing me, and thank you guys for allowing me to spend some time with you guys. It's evening time for you guys. It's middle of the day for me, so if you hear screaming or anything, that's totally fine. It's just my kids and they're home. So this is really personal to me and my family. My husband was adopted at birth, and when we met and got married, we decided that adoption was something we always wanted to do. So our oldest 2 children are biologically ours, and then our youngest child is ours through adoption. So there's a lot of, in fact, last night we spent time on a call with our youngest play therapist for a parent consultation. So this is very much unfolding in real time in our life. So our oldest child, Emerson, she is 9, and our middle one, Will, is 7. And then our baby boy, Webb, is 3. So I'll reference them because they make great teaching examples. So all the time. So I'm going to dive right in, and I'm going to follow. I provided you guys with a handout. I'm going to follow that if you take notes or however you learn. So I'm going to talk about attachment, and attachment is the psychological word or the fancy word for psychology or for relationships that we use in counseling and psychology. It's what the Bible references as relationships, and what we know from a scientific viewpoint, but what we know more importantly from scripture is that God hardwired us for relationships. He created us to be in relationship with people, others, and with Him. And those relationships are absolutely foundational and crucial to our well-being. And they shape us in more ways than any other experience does. It shapes who we are. So it's very interesting, especially thinking about now in light of our current global circumstances with the coronavirus, that we are all hopefully sheltering in place as much as we can, but we are limiting our contact with other relationships that are life-giving and that are needed. And so this is very much going to impact how we do things. And I know we're going to talk about that at the end, but we're created for relationships, and attachments, or our attachment, is a direct outgrowth of how God hardwired us. Okay. So when we look at attachment theory came on the scene from a guy named John Bowlby, and he was a British psychiatrist, and he started his research around the world wars when he noticed that there were changes in how children related to their parents, or how they did in life, especially after in Europe, when, especially Great Britain, when children were shipped into the country to avoid being killed by bombs and war, but they were away from their parents. Oh, go ahead.
Into the countryside.
Yes, sorry, into the countryside, correct. And their parents stayed behind, and some of them lived and some of them did not. And so he noticed that those relationships were pretty crucial. And another thing that kind of stemmed out of attachment research with Bowlby's work was the gold standard for caring for children and adolescents when they were hospitalized was that parents in particular were not allowed to be with their kids. So as soon as a child would be taken to the hospital to have a procedure, to be hospitalized for something, their parents would have to wait. And one of the things that they noticed in this research was that, or just in life, many of the children that absolutely should have recovered from a simple procedure or a simple illness, many of them died. And so it led to this understanding through research and time that when a parent or a caregiver is a crucial aspect of a child's life, and when a child is hurting or is ill, if you remove that parent, it actually causes the child to further dysregulate, or to further become diminished in their health because they don't have that person. And so that just started a huge wave of research about attachment theory. Later on, a student of John Bowlby, Mary Ainsworth, developed what we call the strange situation. And the strange situation is a scientific way of looking at secure and insecure attachment. So that's what I'm going to focus on with you guys. So I want you to think, when we think of attachment and we think of relationships, don't think from the moment the baby comes out of the womb. I want you to think from the moment that child is conceived. In particular, even from the third trimester on, because now we know scientifically that everything that happens in utero is just as powerful as everything that happens outside of the womb. So our little guy, he's been with us since the moment he came out of the womb. I mean, I was there when he was born in the delivery room, and I was the first one to touch him next to the doctor. I did skin to skin. I mean, we've had that little guy from the minute he came into the world.
You're referring to your adopted son.
Yes. Yeah. And the other two, obviously I was there for those as well. I was present, kind of. But in utero, the stress that a mom can experience and feel, and how her environment impacts her, directly impacts that child. So if she's exposed to a lot of maternal stress, if she's exposed to abuse or to poor resources, so she's not getting enough nutrients, that's all going to impact that baby and their attachment style. Okay. But from the moment a child exits the womb, there's a great saying by an author. I put him in the resource section. His name is Dr. Kurt Thompson. He says, "We all come into the world looking for someone looking for us." And that so captures the heart of attachment, is we are looking for someone who's looking for us. And so all of the experiences that a child has, especially in the first 5 years, 5 years is critical for brain development, and it's critical for attachment development. In those first 5 years, if that child has a sense that they are seen, safe, soothed, and secure, they will achieve what we call secure attachment. And what secure attachment is going to do is it's going to kind of lay the foundation of a person's relational house. So you think about, and scripture references this, if you build a house on a rock, the structure is going to be more sturdy. If you build a house on sand, the structure is not going to be sturdy at all. And so secure attachment is kind of like building someone's relationship house on rock. And the way it's like building it on rock is we go through life and we anticipate and we view all other relationships through the lens of how we experienced our main caregivers. So let me unpack that. So if you have a secure attachment with your main caregivers, I'm going to say mom and dad, but it could be anybody. When we talk about attachment, we just need a warm human body that's older. So grandmother, grandfather, aunt, uncle, nanny, babysitter, mom and dad, it doesn't matter. We just need a warm body that's a human. So whoever your main attachment figure is, it will shape your expectation of other relationships. And so if you come out of those first 5 years, and let's just say for funsies that all 18 years before adulthood are really stable or fairly stable, and you have a sense that you're seen, safe, soothed, and secure, you are going to go into other relationships anticipating that that is the way that other people will be in life. So you will go into romantic relationships with a sense of security. You won't be too jealous. You won't be too paranoid. You won't be too distant. You'll do relationships well. So what seen, safe, soothed, and secure are. Seen is when it kind of goes to the next bullet point of what we call attunement. Attunement is where I can mirror and match other people correctly. So that means when one of my kids is having a meltdown and they're crying, I respond in a way that is appropriate to that. So if they're crying and they're having a meltdown, if I'm going to be well attuned, I'm not going to laugh. I'm not going to be like, hey, let's play around and joke. Because in that moment, that's not being well attuned. So someone sees you. Also, seeing you has the implied understanding that you have the ability to take into context the whole picture. So so last night, my oldest daughter, we kept our oldest kids up for a little bit to watch praise and worship service from our church. And it's gotten kind of hot here. So we'd swam most of the day and we'd played hard and we did homeschool. And my oldest child was exhausted, like she was worn out. And at one point I asked her to do something. I think I asked her to eat her dinner and she snapped back and she was like, I'm fine. And so in that moment, there was a lot that welled up within me. If I'm being well attuned, I can see, okay, she's exhausted, she's hungry, and she has a low hungry, angry tolerance to begin with. So if I can see her in her circumstances and know she's starving and she's tired, so I need to probably still maintain good boundaries, but recognize she's not being a defiant, difficult child. She's having a hard time accessing her resources, and she needs me to step in. Okay.
That's the attunement part. Being
Yes.
attuned to where she is, what's going on in her environment, in her what might be.
Yes. And that's being seen. That's me being able to see her for who she is.
Right.
Okay. Safe is just what it sounds like. You have an implied sense that the person that's your main caregiver, they're not going to intentionally harm you. They're not going to seek to harm you. They're not going to intentionally scare you. Okay. And you guys notice how I'm saying intentionally. So secure attachment springs forth from doing these things about 30 to 50% of the time. So we're not talking about perfection. We're not even talking about a passing grade. because we're not even shooting for 70%. So if you can just be well attuned about half the time, your kid's going to be okay. Soothed is when my kid or when my spouse or when my best friend is having a hard time and they're dysregulated, I can be the more mature brain in the moment, and I can help soothe them so that their brain can kind of piggyback off of my brain. And that's a really, really important part of attachment with kids. And the reason it's important is because kids they've not had enough time to form these, what we call neurological ruts, or basically habits. They've not lived long enough to form habits to be good at things yet. So I've lived a lot longer than my kids have. So I've had a lot more opportunities to successfully bring myself under control when I don't get my way or when I'm anxious or stressed. And so kids just don't have that ability. Also, if you're talking about children that are coming out of a foster care situation or who maybe were adopted at birth but had a really adverse pregnancy experience, they don't have as many resources as, say, my older two kids that I've had since conception. And I had complete control over what I put into my body, and I have a husband that took really good care of me. So kids that don't have these early experiences, they're going to have less resources than other children because they just haven't had the time. So we want to soothe children and even our spouses at times when they're dysregulated. And it looks different based on the age, but it means that when my little one falls down and cries, or when my middle one gets hurt at school, their feelings get hurt, I don't want to say things like, you just got to toughen up. That's just tough. That's not really helpful in that moment because I'm not letting their brain access my brain. So I can say things like, oh, wow, buddy, that really would have hurt my feelings too. And I'm so sorry that they said those mean things to you at school. I can see that really hurt your feelings. Go ahead, Nathan.
In the adoption circle, I've heard the idea of inviting a child into your calm, not going to chaos.
I love that. That's so great. That's such a great thing. Yeah. You're going to want to do everything you can to maintain your calm and to, again, invite them into that for sure. That's so great. Okay, the last one is secure. And secure is a sense that you're not going to leave me. You're not going to reject me. You're not going anywhere. And especially for children that has not been their overarching experience in life, that's a really important piece. And so that's something that I coach parents on that have children that they've adopted from the foster care system or that they're fostering, to say, no matter what you do, you're still our child, and we still love you. And a great thing to always point back to is the cross on that. It's not about what I do to earn Jesus's approval. It's about what he did for me. And everything I do totally flies in the face of being deserving of his love. So you just want to make sure they know that you're not going anywhere. Okay, so that's secure attachment. Mentalization is also, it goes along with attunement. Mentalization is the piece of me being able to empathize with someone and to put myself in their shoes and to say, oh, this would, I can imagine how this felt for them. So there's two diagrams at the top of the sheet, and it's called the attachment cycle. So the one on the left, we see what happens when a child has a need, they feel distressed. And what happens is their sympathetic nervous system, their accelerator gets pushed, and they get into distress mode. Now, in secure attachment situations, when that need is met and they receive comfort, and the parent calms them or feeds them or changes them, whatever it is that the kid needs in those moments, it soothes their brain, and it creates this expectation that when I have a need, my caregiver meets that need and does it appropriately, and I can trust them. And it creates a sense of trust. Okay. Now, let's go on to insecure attachment on the other side. So with insecure attachment, what happens is the child is distressed, their accelerator and their autonomic nervous system gets activated. When that need is not met on a fairly regular basis, so about half the time, it leads to distress. Now, when it's repeatedly not met, it creates so much chronic distress that the child goes into fight or flight, and sometimes into freeze, and that's the parasympathetic nervous system. And the brain releases all kinds of chemicals that keep this child in this heightened sense of arousal and in distress. Okay. So one of the things I want you to know is on the attachment cycle side, when things are not going well in insecure attachment and a child is on heightened alert, they are not able to, they're not able to take on new information. They're not able to learn. They're not able to do all the things that a kid does in life, or to connect with other people, because their parasympathetic nervous system has hijacked them. Okay. So that is what we don't want to have happen. And when we look at insecure attachment, it comes in 3 subcategories. So secure attachment is just a category in and of itself. Insecure attachment is these 3 subcategories: avoidant, ambivalent, and disorganized. So
while we wait for Andi to come back in, to log in again, one of the things that we know in this attachment, in this fight, flight, or fight phase, is that children, just because their brain is in fight, flight, or fight, doesn't mean that they're manifesting that. There was a doctor who was working with children who had been exposed to serious trauma, and he was checking children at night. He was doing rounds, and he was checking children who had been through a very traumatic situation, and he was checking their pulses while they slept, and he found that their pulses were operating at a very high rate, which meant that their brains were flooding with stress chemicals. So we know from both from those kind of incidents, as well as from brain scans, that children can be giving the appearance of being very calm, not showing signs of fight, flight, but inside of their brain, they're totally there. But we lost you for a minute, Andi.
Hey, yeah, so sorry. I am so sorry. Okay, it sounds like what you're sharing was super great though, right there. Okay, so with avoidant attachment, this is the child that experiences their parent as just not emotionally available. So they may meet all of their needs. The parent may not be scary or abusive at all. They're just not very emotionally there. One of the things, there was a study recently in the United States, we are having a rise in avoidant attachment because of the increase in technology. So technology is great, as we're seeing, because we can still stay connected during this time that we're all on lockdown. However, if you are, if as a parent, you're spending the majority of your time looking at a device, even when you're present with your kids, that's going to interfere with them having a secure attachment. So it's not an abusive thing. It's just you're not really psychologically, mentally present. Mm-hmm. Also, avoidant attachment can come when you have a family that's just not, emotions have not been useful. And so people just they're not useful. And so people just kind of check out and don't access those. The next one is ambivalent. And ambivalent is where the parent is so overwhelmed by their own emotions and having a hard time regulating themselves. Again, maybe not in an abusive way, just they're very anxious. They're very insecure in some ways. It's going to create what we call ambivalent attachment. And the child experiences the ambivalent parent as, I don't know what I'm going to get. Am I going to get someone who's available and warm and caring? Or am I going to get someone who's overly anxious and worried? Am I going to get someone who's angry? So the ambivalent parent is hard to anticipate whether they're going to be regulated or dysregulated. And then disorganized attachment. This is the most severe. And the majority of children that are going to be removed from a parenting situation, so they're going to be in a system of some sort, they are going to probably have what we call a disorganized attachment. And the reason it's called disorganized is because there's no way of, when Ainsworth was studying it, there was no way to really categorize what their style was, because the child would do really bizarre things when they were studying the child. They'd self-injure, or they just did really odd behaviors. And so this is your high abuse, high stress, high perhaps not medicated mental illness. That is your type of situation that you're looking at. And it's easy to look at parents that come in this situation and to villainize them. But I think it's so important to understand the context that the parent comes from. They're doing the best they can with what they had, and what they had was very limited. And what we know is that attachment is passed down from parent to child. Mm-hmm. And so if you have a parent that has a disorganized attachment, it is quite possible because they came from a situation where they had a disorganized attachment, or they had a very traumatic upbringing. Okay. So I was a little bit harder on parents before I became one, because I was a play therapist and a clinician long before I was a mom. Mm-hmm. And being a mom totally changed my tune, because I've had the moments where my kid like slaps me in Target, and I think, oh gosh. So we want to give them grace too, and understand where they're coming from. Okay. Sure. So when, now we all have needs, and think back to this attachment cycle. So we are needy people. God created us with needs, even before the fall. And needs are not sinful or wrong. And so as kids have needs, they will do whatever they need to do to get those needs met. If they're in a securely attached environment, those needs will be met, and they won't have to try other strategies. When you have a child that's in an insecure environment or a high trauma situation, their needs are not getting met. And so it looks like really dysregulated, inappropriate behavior, but it's really their strategies on how to get those needs met. So it's the result of the trauma, and it's the result of them, I have a need to feel secure, or I have a need for food, or I have a need to be changed on a regular basis, my diaper changed. It can look like very dysregulated, inappropriate, defiant behavior. What it is for those kids is they're just trying to get their needs met, and the strategies they've used have not worked. And so now they're moving on to other strategies that are more maladaptive.
Right. And by this point, they have been through probably a longer period of fight, flight, and fright. So they're not working with they're not using their executive function to make better choices or find better solutions.
Right, exactly. So they're working off of their brainstem. So when we spend a significant amount of time in chronic distress, the executive functioning, which is situated in the cortex, the outermost layer of the brain, it doesn't have access, because the body is just trying to maintain the basic needs and safety. And so it's the brainstem that is driving. It's the one that's in charge. And that's not helpful, because we make poor decisions when we're constantly in chronic stress. It's kind of like when and I know Andi is going to do a presentation coming up on Monday, I believe, about anxiety. I know that'll be so good. When you're anxious, you don't make the best decisions. There are certain seasons in my life, and I'm like, I'm just not going to make any decisions. I'm not going to cut my hair. We're not going to buy anything major because I'll make a really poor decision. So when a child or an adult is in chronic distress, they can't make good decisions because they can't access that part of their brain. Yeah. Also, one of the things when we look at, I'm going to switch to more the practical side for the time we have left. So when we look at helping individuals that have chronic trauma or chronic distress, especially when it's coming from their attachment experiences with their original main caregivers and then caregivers that they're having in the aftermath of that, it's really helpful to understand that they will emotionally and sometimes behaviorally act more like a younger chronological age and less like their actual chronological age. So one thing I see with my 3-year-old is he's actually physically kind of like 4 or 5. He's kind of a humongous child. But when he's dysregulated, he looks a lot like an 18-month-old. He functions like an 18-month-old. He has fits like an 18-month-old. I've had a lot of clients that I've worked with and a lot of clients that a lot of counselors that I've supervised. When you're working with adults that have trauma, they may be 40, but usually they tend to act emotionally like the age at which their trauma first started. So if you're looking at children and adolescents that have had really impoverished environments, and when I say impoverished, I don't just mean like they've not had money. They've had poor attachment experiences. They've had caregivers that were trying really hard, but were really doing a poor job. That means that they're going to act more like their younger ages and less like the age that they are chronologically. So when we look at that, the things we want to do is we want to meet their needs based on the emotional age that's presenting when they're dysregulated. So and a lot of times that does not look appropriate when you look at it from the outside looking in. And I remember I first saw this when I first was working on my doctorate, and that was the first time I started working with child clients. I had a little one who was very young, like just had turned 3, so little bitty, and had already been removed from her parents' home because it had been discovered that her birth father had sexually molested her. And so this little one was super dysregulated. And I remember one time she came into the playroom, and we have baby dolls and we have passies and we have all kinds of stuff like that. And I remember one session, she wanted to crawl into my lap and she wanted me to feed her with the baby bottle. And so, I mean, that brought up a lot for me. So I was like, oh, you can't sit in my lap. I'm a therapist. But I proposed to her mom. It was then the foster mom that was hoping to adopt. I said, I think you really need to get a bottle at home and you need to feed her. And that sounded so odd. But when the needs aren't met early, they don't just go away. They have to be met, and you have to work through the trauma to get to a different place. And so sometimes even older kids, like a 9 or a 10 or a 12-year-old, you may not need to feed them from a bottle, but they may need to be wrapped up tight and held on your lap. Or they may need that soothing touch that you would give an infant. But if they just didn't have it, they have this gaping hole that they need. So part of secure attachment is safe and loving touch. That's good. So you think about all the things you do with an infant in the early days that are so important that really you think this is not that big of a deal. You just do it. But with a baby, you hold them close. We talk a ton about skin to skin, that they can't regulate their body temperature, but getting near an adult skin to skin wise can help them regulate. That's also building the building blocks of attachment. So things like just holding them for hours. So one of the things with my little one, he wants to be wrapped up in a blanket and held for a long time. And so one of the benefits of being at home indefinitely is that we have lots of time to do that. And so there's times that I'll hold him. One of the things that we introduced recently was a baby bottle. We introduced that back into his world because he's really like an 18-month-old. And so there are times when he's dysregulated, we'll wrap him up in his favorite blanket and we'll give him a bottle. And if from the outside looking in, that looks so wrong. Like, I'm sure his pediatrician would lose his mind. His pediatric dentist would definitely lose his mind, because it doesn't look right. But when we have children that have impoverished experiences, you've got to go back and provide those things. And sometimes it just looks weird to other people outside the world, but conceptualize them from their emotional age, not their chronological age. And some kids go back and forth, and then some kids just emotionally are always at a specific age. Okay. So I mentioned this, that attachment style comes from the parent's attachment style. So one of the most important things you can do to love your kids well is to work on your stuff. So evaluating what your attachment style is, because one, we know that there are no perfect parents, so that's comforting and difficult at the same time. But if you will parent the way that you were parented and received your attachment. So we usually do a little bit better, about 20% better, 20 to 30% better than our own parents. But if we've not had any transformative experiences to do what we call earned secure attachment, we're going to have a really hard time giving that to our kids. So there's a great saying by a play therapy guy. He says, you can't give away that which you don't possess. Mm-hmm. And so in some ways, as parents, we have to do our own work to evaluate what's my attachment style and how does this impact how I do parenting. And so if you can work on your own stuff and have healing there, it all kind of trickles downhill. So when I teach my students at DTS, I talk to them about any of the experiences you have with your parents that you're working with. As you're helping them heal, it will just kind of flow downstream to their children. And so there's a couple of really great books for this. Anatomy of the Soul is one that is spectacular, and it talks a lot about how our attachment style directly impacts how we attach to God as a heavenly Father. So it takes a faith-based approach as well. Also, there's Parenting from the Inside Out by Dan Siegel. It's not a faith-based book, but he talks a lot about how our attachment styles impact how we parent. So evaluating your attachment style. So one thing to add with that too is that just to be complicated, we can have multiple attachment styles to different caregivers. So you usually have about 2 or 3 main attachment figures, and your attachment figure is kind of your secure base. So think about when you played tag as a kid, there was always home base or secure base. Your attachment figure is the person or the persons you want to go to when you're having a really hard day. And as adults, that shifts to usually be a best friend or a spouse. So like my husband, when I have a really bad day, he's the first person I want to call or who I want to see. So with that, I just went blank with where I was going. So sorry. But,
well, I was going to throw in here that attachments aren't static either, are they?
Right. Exactly.
They're not standing still.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, with multiple attachments. So you could have a secure attachment from one parent and an insecure attachment from another. And it is possible that you could have a pretty stable first couple years of life and then have perhaps a global pandemic, and that could change things. Now, the one difference with that though is if you have a solid foundation to begin with, that is still better than not having a solid foundation at all, because you still have all those resources that have been developed. Mm-hmm. So, but it is possible that you could have this dramatic experience that changes things. I want to talk about one more thing, and then I know we're going to transition to kind of the here and now. So when we talk about healing attachment wounds, the way you heal yours that you have as an adult is you have to have a reparative experience with someone that helps you meet those needs that you didn't have met originally. And so the Anatomy of the Soul book gives some great examples of how specifically you can use your relationship with God to help you heal those wounds with kind of imagining that He is speaking things over you. Or if you have marriage and intimate relationships are a great place to have healing. So if you, we tend to respond to the past more than we respond to the current. So what I mean by that is, a lot of current day relationship problems, especially in intimate relationships, stem from those early relationships with caregivers that were not healthy. And so rather than responding to our partner or our spouse, we respond like it's our parent. And so if you can have a reparative experience where you respond in a certain way that is healing, and they respond in a healing way, it can heal that. And so, there's always a growth opportunity when you're stuck in the house together. This last week, my husband's job is a little less busy right now, and mine's still kind of at full steam. And there was a day that he was with the kids for about 8 or 9 hours, and I was in the bedroom working and teaching and doing meetings. And he was pretty fried at the end of that day. And I was kind of fried too, but for different reasons. And I just felt such an amount of shame that I shouldn't be doing that. And it's interfering with his world. And as we talked through it, we were able to see that this has more to do with my stuff from my early upbringing of feeling like I can't inconvenience anyone, or it's my job to keep the family, to keep everybody happy and all things copacetic. So seeing that I was experiencing that from my early attachment wounds, not from my current experience with my spouse. Now with kids, the way you begin to heal things, I've given you some examples of you have to meet their emotional age need. Also, when you cause the rupture or when you cause the break in the relationship, so we have what we call benign ruptures. That's just like you say something harsh and it was an accident, or you get off the phone too quickly. Those aren't really that big of a deal. Limit setting ruptures are when anybody, tells you no or sets a boundary. They're good and they're helpful, but they still don't feel good to hear. The third one is toxic ruptures, and toxic ruptures occur out of our brokenness. And so if I'm having a hard day and I'm not doing a good job of accessing my resources, and one of my kids spills something on the floor and I'm like, I can't believe you always make so many messes. That's a pretty toxic rupture right there. So if I don't come back and repair that, what's probably going to happen is my kid is going to internalize that as, man, I'm a mess. Because what our brains default to is we want to protect the caregiver figure in our minds, because there's too much anxiety when we have a parent that's supposed to protect us but also causes us pain. And so what we internalize that and we make it about ourselves. And so over and over, what will happen is maybe my kid thinks, man, I just can't do anything right. I'm a total mess. And then that, develops and spurs on to other things, or they're
blaming themselves. They're blaming themselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, kind of like I shared with my example this week of feeling like it was my job to make sure everybody's happy. That's a message I picked up on, either inadvertently or directly from my upbringing. So we don't want to have that happen. So when you cause a rupture, especially a toxic rupture, you want to come back and you want to own it. And so if I was going to own that with one of my kids, I'd say, I'm going to pretend it was my daughter, Emerson, I'm so sorry I snapped at you. That was just an accident, and accidents happen and it's not a big deal. And I snapped because I'm having a hard day, and that was all about me and not about you. I'm so sorry, sweet girl. Would you consider forgiving me? So what I did in that moment is I took the responsibility for it. And I said, Mom's kind of a mess. It's me. And research shows, this is what the crazy thing is, and I think this just points to God's grace. Research shows that those ruptures and repairs are actually far more beneficial than if you never caused a rupture at all.
Wow.
Yeah, that's huge.
Wow,
so, if you think about physiologically, like if you've broken a bone, they say if you set the bone correctly, it will fuse back together and be stronger than it was before the break. that's exactly what's happening neurologically and emotionally and relationally, is when you mess up and you cause a rupture, when you come back and repair it, you're causing your relational rupture to become stronger than it was before. Mm-hmm. So if you don't hear anything else today, what matters most is what you do after what you've done.
Well, that's really good news, Andi. I want to remind people that if you have any questions, we're looking at another 15 minutes or so to wrap up here. If you have questions, please be sure to write them in the chat to Arfo, and we'll try to address as many questions as we can.
Yeah. So I'll hand it back to you, Nathan, as to transition.
Yeah. Well, while people are thinking about questions, we were talking a little bit earlier. We're spending a lot of time. The world, 1 billion children are spending excessive time with each other, in their families right now. They're not allowed to go to school, and we're physically together. But is that the same thing as us having good attachment right now during this time?
No, it's not. So that kind of goes back to the whole rise in avoidant attachment that we're seeing in the U.S. is that we're potentially having a whole generation of individuals that are in their parents' presence, and their parents are not abusive, but because they're not psychologically tuned in, it's causing insecure attachment. So yeah, we could, there's a great opportunity in what we have for us right now to build in some really sweet times as a family. But if we don't embrace it, we'll miss it.
Yeah. That's a good point. I've been thinking about a question myself here. So if someone, going back as a different topic now, but going back to the parents' attachment challenge, mm-hmm. If someone, they're a parent now, or they're thinking about adopting or becoming parents, and they say, well, I've got a my situation was, not very, very good. Does that disqualify a person from being able to be a good parent and be able to develop a good, healthy attachment with their child?
Oh, no, not at all. Not at all. I think in some ways, if you're willing as a parent to lean into your own experiences and do look at some of those hard experiences and find healing, you are so much better off for that kid, because you understand that kid in a way that other adults might not, because you had an impoverished experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're also, I can also see the benefit in growing over or growing through things, because things are going to happen to people. Life happens. Coronavirus is happening, and it's a challenge no one gets to sidestep, and it's a great thing to overcome our own personal challenges, to take responsibility and work with them, and to have hope and to give hope.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, everyone's experience and situation is unique, so ours is not going to speak to everybody. But I've now had the experience of giving birth to a couple of kids, and I've had the experience of adopting a child. And we sometimes mistakenly think that we have a lot of control over those experiences with children that we give birth to, and really we don't. And those experiences have been just as hard for me with the children that joined our family biologically as the experiences that my child who joined us from adoption have been. And so I think it's, having had both of those experiences, it's not that one is easier over the other, it's just hard in different ways. My husband, we work a lot in marriage ministry, and he likes to say, hard is normative in marriage. When people come to us and they're like, man, this is so hard, and they think that they're not doing it right, he's like, yeah, that's what marriage is. Marriage is, it's hard, but it's good. And that's how parenting is. It's going to be hard no matter where those kids came from, because they reveal so much about our character and about our brokenness, and they're broken, and we're all trying to do this in a broken world.
Yeah. We do have a question. Someone is asking, how do you help someone heal after they went through a tough rupture and the relationship never repaired, especially if it was someone that they looked up to? So you
That's
have and not an immediate repair.
Yeah. So the thing I hear in that is grief. And grief, I can't speak for Romanian culture. I can only speak for what I know in America. So this may be different for y'all. But in America, we don't do grief very well. We just don't like it. So we're like, yeah, I'm out. I don't want to do it at all. And when you have a rupture that's toxic and it's never repaired, it creates a grief that needs to be felt and needs to be acknowledged. And so part of it is having someone walk alongside you that sees your pain and acknowledges your pain and doesn't diminish your pain. And there's, when we look at grief studies, there's a lot of evidence that points to the healing comes in the telling. And so for adults and adolescents, there's a lot of healing in telling your story about what it was like to lose those things that were important. And so I think a lot of it is telling and validation. And there is a point at which trauma does need to be healed through a professional avenue. So if there's trauma there, it could potentially need to be healed through a counselor or a pastoral care person. But again, part of it is having someone see it and acknowledge it and not minimize it.
Yeah, and I know from I've seen this in another place. Actually, that telling in healthy grieving requires an attachment.
Yes,
it's another attachment that actually heals a broken attachment.
Absolutely.
And can that attachment be to the same person, or can it be to? Does it have to be to a different person?
It can totally be a different person. Absolutely. Yeah.
It could also be the same person if the person realizes.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, that's an amazing thing when that does happen, especially when we talk about parent-child dyads, and it's maybe an adult to an adult parent-child dyad, that a parent has done work and they have enough ego strength to acknowledge that they did a poor job and they hurt their child, even if it was inadvertent. Mm-hmm. But that's kind of those are the rare occasions. Usually it's from someone who can act as an attachment figure when your attachment figure isn't there.
Yeah, substitute. Yeah. We have another question. Someone was asking about the age of your adopted child of Wes compared to your other children, and he said, is there a difference between your attachment to the biological children and to your adopted child?
No, actually, and it's funny because I got that question from one of our friends that adopted after us, and she was like, her specific question was, how do I attach to this child if I can't nurse them? And I was like, well, I can help with that. I hated nursing, so that wasn't useful at all for me. The body does something whenever you have prolonged physical contact, and prolonged is more than 20 seconds. If you have physical contact that's positive with someone for 20 seconds, a woman's brain will release oxytocin and a man's brain will release vasopressin. And that chemical causes you to want to trust and to bond with the person you're having contact with. And it causes you to want more of the same experience. And so going into getting Webb, I knew that we needed to have as much skin to skin time as we possibly could to release as much oxytocin and as much vasopressin into both of our bodies, because physiologically, God just designed the body to do that. And I knew if we did that, it would just make it happen. So I haven't experienced a difference with him and my other two, but I knew going in, like, I just needed to kind of douse my brain and my husband's brain in physical contact so that those chemicals would be released.
Yeah. Okay. Another question here. Thank you, Andi. How can you help someone with a dependent personality issues to get out of a toxic relationship?
Oh, that's a hard one. But a great question. Yeah. So, it depends on how toxic the relationship is, the method that you'll use. So if you want to define toxic as domestic violence, there are very specific ways and means to go about that. And the intention is for sure to help the person who's trying to exit the relationship stay alive. So whenever I work with anyone, I'm always going to make sure they're working with a professional that is skilled in that way, because the leaving is the time when most people who are being abused are killed. So that's an important factor to note. Part of it is discovering in the relationship, what does that relationship serve? What need does it meet? And when we can figure out what the need is that's being met and we can address it appropriately, it makes it not easy, but it makes it, you're more informed of what need you need to meet in different ways. Also, what I just said about the vasopressin and the oxytocin release, if you have had intimate contact, and that can be a long hug all the way to intercourse with someone, it's going to kind of trick your brain. Even though the person is harmful to you and not safe, it tricks your brain into wanting to trust them and to want to have more contact with them. And so some of it is you get kind of tangled up in this web that it's hard to get out of because of what the brain does when you have contact. So part of it is stopping that type of contact.
Mm-hmm. And that sounds like also a question that needs to be picked up with a professional in Romania. That's a little more depth in that. And certainly if the person wants to write us at ARFA, we can recommend someone to help follow up with that in a more...
Yes.
So we have about 2 more minutes, and there's one final question here that we can take. What about the quote unquote grown kids as adults relating to their older parents? What are the chances for them to try to repair the relationship with their parents?
Yeah, so neurologically speaking, the brain is plastic all the way through old age and death. So what that means is you can create changes in your brain until death as an old person. So there's always the potential for those relationships to be healed. What I've noticed happen sometimes is that the adult child really desires healing, but the adult parent does not. And so in those situations, the adult child has to do work outside of the relationship to bring healing and perhaps forgive their parents. And if it's not an abusive relationship, perhaps still be in contact with your parents, but understand the limitations of their growth. So there is a point at which people potentially outgrow their parents' emotional and spiritual maturity. And so it gives the adult child the opportunity to grow in a place of accepting their parents' limitations. And then sometimes in situations, adult parents are very much willing to own and recognize the harm that they may have caused and are willing to seek restoration. It just depends on everybody's willingness. But even if the parents aren't willing, that doesn't mean that the child can't have healing. It just looks different.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you for that, Andi. And my mind was going back to the earlier question about another secure adult that can help provide attachment. So if your parent is not able to come to terms with that, a healing way to get that relationship back on track can be through establishing a healthy relationship, so you have that need met, and then you meet your parent on whatever level they're willing to meet you at.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we have another question, but I think we're just about at our time limit here. Would it be okay if we if we share your email and maybe answer that question privately?
Absolutely.
Okay. And we can do that in the follow-up information that we send out to the listeners. Andi, we want to thank you for sharing your expertise, your personal experience as well, your personal connection with adoption. It's been very interesting, very meaningful to me to listen, and reinforces some things, brings some new angles, and it's really good news. What I heard some really good news, for parents that are, especially now with the increased stress. You and I were talking off camera at the beginning, that some of the statistics in a time of crisis, that the children actually, when they have limited movement, that there's an increase in stress for families, and unfortunately increase abuse for children, whether it's emotional, physical. So that's good news for the time we're in, right now.
Yeah, definitely.
Andi, thank you. We're going to be having you back in the near future for other webinars, some other information, other opportunities that people will get to hear you. And we just want to let people who are watching know that, yes, Monday evening, Andi will be addressing the question of anxiety. How do we deal with anxiety in the time of crisis? And we're certainly looking forward to that. And we want to, especially during this time, we want to let people who are enjoying the webinar, and listening, just let them know that we're a listener, we're a donor supported organization, and we depend on the generous gifts of people, little, large gifts, and any shape or size, that ARFO is not funded by some large grants or anything like that. It's individual people make a big part of the donations that help us to be able to do webinars like this and different activities. So we're grateful for the generosity of anyone who's able to come alongside of us in that way. So one more time, Andi, thank you.
Thank you.
To you and to everyone listening, stay safe, and we'll be in touch real soon.
All right. Sounds good. Have a good night.
Thank you.